For decades, the disputed Kuril Islands have remained one of the most sensitive fault lines between Russia and Japan. But in August 2026, that frozen dispute suddenly became a much bigger strategic confrontation. After Vladimir Putin delivered harsh remarks aimed at Japan, he made a highly symbolic visit to the disputed island of Iturup, known in Japan as part of the Northern Territories. It was the first time in his 26 years in power that Putin had personally visited the island. The message was impossible to miss. Putin toured a fish processing facility, visited a hospital and a school, and presented the trip as proof that Russia's presence in the region was permanent. But in Tokyo, the visit was interpreted very differently, as a deliberate challenge to Japan's territorial claims and to the wider Western alliance. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi condemned the visit, calling it completely unacceptable. Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi summoned Russia's ambassador and delivered an official protest. Moscow, however, showed little interest in backing down. Dmitry Medvedev declared that the Kuril Islands would remain Russian territory permanently and warned that anyone challenging that reality should expect serious consequences. The diplomatic temperature had suddenly risen. But why would Putin intensify a confrontation with Japan while Russia is already fighting a massive war in Ukraine? Because the Kurils are not simply about territory. They are about geography, naval power and access to Russia's nuclear deterrent. And behind the confrontation is a much larger strategic contest involving Russia, China, Japan and the United States. The Northern Gate. The Kuril chain forms a natural barrier between the Pacific Ocean and the Sea of Okhotsk. For Moscow, that geography is enormously valuable. Russian forces have transformed key islands such as Iturup and Kunashir into heavily defended military positions. Coastal missile systems, air defenses and other capabilities turn the islands into a formidable defensive belt. The strategic purpose goes far beyond protecting a few islands. The Sea of Okhotsk is a critical operating area for Russia's ballistic missile submarines, including its Boryai-class nuclear submarines. Keeping hostile forces away from this region is therefore a major Russian security priority. From Moscow's perspective, losing control of the Kurils could create new access points for Japanese and American forces. That is why Putin's visit carried far more significance than a normal presidential tour. It was a message to Tokyo and Washington. Russia intends to keep the Northern Gateway closed. But Japan is becoming much more capable of challenging that position. Japan is changing. For decades, Japan's military posture was built around territorial defense. That is changing rapidly. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's growing military pressure around Taiwan and the East China Sea, and North Korea's expanding missile program, Tokyo has accelerated a historic transformation of its defense forces. Japan has increased military spending, reorganized its command structure and moved toward capabilities that can strike enemy launch sites and military bases. The creation of the Japan Joint Operations Command has made it easier to coordinate the country's land, sea, and air forces during a major crisis. And Japan is no longer relying exclusively on short-range defensive weapons. One of the most important changes is the acquisition of hundreds of American Tomahawk cruise missiles. With a range of roughly 1,600 kilometers, these weapons give Japan the ability to strike targets far beyond its immediate coastline. That changes the strategic calculation for both Russia and China. Tokyo is also extending the range of its domestically produced Type 12 anti-ship missiles and developing new hypersonic weapons, including the hypervelocity gliding projectile system. The objective is straightforward. Make the waters around Japan so dangerous that an enemy fleet cannot approach without facing enormous risk. The air war is changing too. Japan is simultaneously building a far more sophisticated air force. Its F-35 fleet is expanding, its F-15s are being upgraded, and the country is participating with Britain and Italy in the Global Combat Air Program, aimed at producing a next-generation fighter. The transformation of the Izumo-class helicopter carriers into platforms capable of operating F-35B aircraft is another major development. Japan is therefore moving from a force designed primarily to defend its islands toward one capable of projecting power across the surrounding seas. And the northern flank is receiving particular attention. Hokkaido sits directly across from Russia's far eastern military positions. Japanese aircraft regularly intercept Russian aircraft approaching Japanese airspace, while ground forces conduct exercises designed to respond to a potential crisis in the north. For Moscow, this creates a difficult problem. Every improvement to Japan's military makes the Kuril Islands more vulnerable. But Russia is not alone. The confrontation cannot be understood by looking only at Moscow and Tokyo. China is creating its own pressure on Japan from the southwest. Beijing's military expansion around Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands has forced Tokyo to think about a conflict that could stretch across multiple fronts. Chinese Type 055 destroyers provide long-range air defense and strike capabilities, while China's DF-21D and DF-26 ballistic missiles are designed to threaten major naval forces operating across the Western Pacific. China is also using economic pressure, including restrictions involving strategically important rare earth materials, increasing concerns inside Japan about supply chain vulnerability. Put these developments together and Japan finds itself under pressure from two major powers. Russia from the north, China from the southwest, and potentially North Korea from the west. That is why Tokyo increasingly sees its security environment as a single interconnected battlefield. Moscow and Beijing move closer. The military relationship between Russia and China has also become increasingly important. Joint naval patrols, bomber operations and military exercises have repeatedly brought Russian and Chinese forces closer to Japanese air and maritime space. Russian Tu-95 strategic bombers and Chinese H-6 aircraft have participated in coordinated operations, while naval forces have operated together across the Western Pacific. These activities force Japan to monitor multiple directions simultaneously. The strategic idea is simple. If Japan must divide its attention between Russia, China and North Korea, its ability to concentrate overwhelming power in one location becomes more difficult. That is the strategic pressure Moscow and Beijing are creating. But it is producing an unintended consequence. Japan is becoming even closer to the United States and its regional partners. America's shield. Japan is not preparing for this confrontation alone. Around 55,000 American military personnel are stationed in Japan, making the country one of the most important pillars of America's military presence in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. 7th Fleet operates from Yokosuka, while American aircraft, submarines, surveillance systems and missile capabilities operate throughout the region. Okinawa remains a critical American air and military hub. American F-35s and F-15s can reinforce Japanese air defenses, while nuclear-powered submarines provide a stealthy capability for monitoring and tracking hostile naval forces. The United States is also testing new long-range missile capabilities in the region, including the Typhoon system, which can employ weapons such as Tomahawk and SM-6. That creates a dangerous calculation for Moscow. A confrontation that begins between Russia and Japan could quickly involve the United States. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty provides Washington with a powerful commitment to Japan's defense in the event of an armed attack on territories under Japanese administration. The disputed Kurils themselves create legal and political complications because Russia controls them. But any attack extending to undisputed Japanese territory, particularly Hokkaido, would create an entirely different situation. The Pacific is becoming a powder keg. The problem becomes even more complicated when South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Britain and other partners are added to the equation. Japan has strengthened defense relationships with Australia and the Philippines, while the United States, Japan and South Korea have expanded security cooperation. The Quad framework involving the United States, Japan, India and Australia adds another layer of strategic coordination across the Indo-Pacific. The result is a growing network of military partnerships surrounding China and Russia. And that may be exactly what Putin's strategy is helping to accelerate. Every Russian military exercise near Japan creates more justification for Japanese rearmament. Every Chinese military maneuver around Taiwan strengthens support for closer US-Japan cooperation. Every North Korean missile launch reinforces the argument that Japan needs stronger offensive and defensive capabilities. In other words, pressure intended to weaken Japan may be producing the opposite result. Putin's gamble. So what is Putin really trying to accomplish? One possibility is deterrence. By personally appearing on the Kuril Islands and showcasing Russian military activity in the region, Putin is demonstrating that Moscow will not surrender its strategic position in the Far East. Another possibility is political pressure. Japan has imposed sanctions on Russia and supported Ukraine. Moscow may want Tokyo to reconsider that policy and reduce its alignment with Washington. But there is also a larger calculation. Russia is already heavily committed in Ukraine. Its military resources are under pressure, and maintaining a powerful Pacific fleet while fighting a major European war is enormously difficult. Opening another crisis with Japan would therefore be an extremely risky move. Russia can threaten Japan. But Japan has become far more capable of threatening Russian positions in return. That is the fundamental change. The new balance. The Japan of today is not the Japan of the early post-war era. It has longer-range missiles. It has advanced submarines. It has F-35 fighters. It has sophisticated destroyers equipped with Aegis systems. It is developing hypersonic weapons. It is building a more integrated command structure. And behind all of this stands the military power of the United States. For Russia, that means the strategic environment around the Kurils is becoming increasingly complicated. For China, it means Japan is becoming a stronger military actor precisely when Beijing is preparing for a possible confrontation over Taiwan. And for Washington, Japan is becoming one of the most important forward positions in the Indo-Pacific. The danger is that all these forces are now operating in an increasingly crowded battle space. Russian aircraft. Chinese warships. Japanese fighters. American submarines. North Korean missiles. One mistake could produce a chain reaction. A radar lock could be misinterpreted. An aircraft could cross the wrong line. A naval encounter could escalate. A missile test could trigger an unnecessary response. And once several major powers begin moving military forces at the same time, controlling escalation becomes extremely difficult. That is why Putin's visit to the Kuril Islands matters far beyond a territorial dispute. It is part of a much larger struggle over who controls the strategic geography of the Western Pacific. Russia wants to preserve its northern fortress. China wants to expand its influence from the southwest. Japan wants to prevent encirclement. And the United States wants to ensure that the first island chain does not fall under the control of its rivals. The result is a Pacific region more heavily armed and more tightly connected than at any point in recent decades. Putin may believe that pressure will force Japan to step back. But there is another possibility. His actions could convince Tokyo to move forward even faster. And if that happens, Russia's attempt to intimidate Japan may ultimately produce the very military power Moscow fears most. The Kuril Islands may be frozen in history. But the strategic competition surrounding them is anything but frozen. The next move belongs to Tokyo, Moscow and Washington. And in a region packed with missiles, submarines, aircraft and nuclear weapons, the difference between deterrence and disaster could come down to a single miscalculation.